Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen, or good morning if you are joining us from the other side of the pond. Welcome to our today publication launch event and discussion on the Central European radical right's impact on EU foreign policy. I'm warmly welcoming our today's speakers, GMF ReThink.CEE fellow Zsuzsanna Végh and the director of Carnegie Europe, Rosa Balfour. My name is Hegedüs and I serve as fellow for Central Europe at the German Marshall Fund. Radical right parties, once a fringe phenomena, became mainstream in European politics during the past decade, among others in Central and Eastern Europe as well. The legislative period 2014-2019 was the first in the history of the European Parliament when a radical right political group lasted from its foundations until the end of the period. Even if the feared breakthrough of radical right forces didn't materialize at the 2019 European parliamentary elections, radical right parties were successful in increasing their political weights both at the European and national level. Being firm and powerful components of the party landscape, radical right parties have an impact both on national and European level foreign policy. But how does this impact look like? What policy priorities do radical right parties try to upload to EU level? What variables appear to influence their ability to shape European foreign policy? And what venues and policy strategies are used by them to pursue their foreign policy preferences? I am extremely delighted that we can discuss all these questions with our distinguished speakers, with Zsuzsanna Végh, who is lecturer and research fellow at the chair of comparative politics at the European University Viadrina, and associate researcher at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Previously, Zsuzsanna worked in the Center for European Neighborhood Studies at the Central European University, and she holds MA degrees in International Relations and European Studies from CEU and the Eötvös Loránd University in Budapest. Her research interests include Hungarian EU and foreign policy, Central European cooperation formats, and the radical right in the EU. She is currently pursuing her PhD in political science at the European University Viadrina. And Rosa Balfour, who is director of Carnegie Europe. Her fields of expertise include European politics, institutions, and foreign and security policy. Her current research focuses on the relationship between domestic politics and Europe's global role. Being a highly prolific author, Rosa has researched and published widely for academia, think tanks, and international media on issues ranging from European politics and international relations, especially the Mediterranean region, Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans, EU enlargement, to international support for civil society, human rights, and democracy. But perhaps the most crucial for us today, she authored several key papers on the impact of the European radical right on EU policies, including foreign policy as well. Rosa is also a member of the steering committee of Women in International Security in Brussels and an associate fellow of LSE Ideas. In 2018 and 2019, she was awarded the fellowship on the Europe's Future program in the Institute for Human Sciences in Vienna. And prior to joining Carnegie Europe, Rosa was a senior fellow at GMF, and she has been also director of the Europe in the World program at the European Policy Center in Brussels. Zsuzsanna, Rosa, thank you both for joining us today. And regarding the housekeeping rules, Zsuzsanna will present her paper's main findings in 15 minutes, followed by Rosa's comments in the same amount of time. Roughly after 45 minutes, we will open up the Q&A, and I would like to encourage you, ladies and gentlemen, to send me your questions either via the Q&A or the chat function of Zoom. And I will either bunch your questions together and forward them to our speakers, or I will unmute you and ask you to pose your question in person. I also would like to remind you that the event is recorded and will be available online at the YouTube channel of the German Marshall Fund. And as I already mentioned, Zsuzsanna Végh's work at GMF is part of GMF ReThink.CEE fellowship program. ReThink.CEE was established in 2018 in order to support the next generation of policy analysts and civic activists from Central and Eastern Europe and the Western Balkans. The main goal of the one-year-long fellowship is to conduct innovative policy research, like Zsuzsanna did, often with a focus on a niche topic, to deliver fresh intellectual and policy impulses to the challenges which are faced throughout the Central and Eastern European region. And having said that, I would like to pass the floor to our today author and speaker, Zsuzsanna. While radical right parties are well known in the public for their anti-migration positions, and some of them also due to their close relationship with authoritarian players like Russia, thorough and comparative investigations into their foreign policy positions, like yours or Rosa's previous researches, are relatively rare. What is the foreign policy agenda Central and Eastern European radical right parties try to upload to the EU level? And what channels do they use to achieve that goal? You have the floor.
Thank you very much for the introduction, Daniel. And thank you, Rosa, for joining us today. I really appreciate. Before I answer your question, Daniel, let me just take a step back and walk you through what my intention was with the paper and how I approached the topic. Indeed, as you said, thorough research on radical right foreign policies, as well as radical right impact on the EU level, is still lacking. And in fact, Rosa's papers are among the few which treat the topic very deeply. So what my intention was here, first of all, is to assess and provide an inventory of what Central European radical right parties think about foreign policy as such, and what kind of channels indeed they may use to upload that to the EU level. In targeting this second angle of the subject, my intention was not to specifically single out policy issues on the current agenda and maybe look back a few years how parties may have impacted that dossier. Rather, I was trying to develop a model or a framework that we can use as a reference tool to assess radical right parties' impact when it comes to the EU level. As I said, research on that so far is relatively rare to come by. And in that regard, adjust that model to the broad area of EU foreign policy. When talking about EU foreign policy, I do not only mean the CFSP and CSDP, but also EU external affairs. So this also informed how I approached developing such a model. So to sum up, I had 3 questions in this paper. What are the priorities of the radical right on foreign policy, and to what extent we can talk about the radical right as a concerted actor on foreign policy? Second, what are the channels and to what extent these channels can be used on EU level foreign policy by the radical right? And third, bringing these together in the current context, looking at the current political cycle, what can we expect? Would the currently influential radical right parties pull in one direction? And if so, on what? If affairs, how it would impact EU foreign policy agenda. Just to clarify, when talking about radical right parties, I refer to Kasmuda's well-known definition identifying radical right parties as nativist, authoritarian, and potentially populist. And in my focus, I was building on the classifications of the populist in selecting the radical right parties to deal with in Central Europe, focusing on the 4 Visegrad countries, and therefore what I consider as the radical right in these 4 countries in Central Europe are Law and Justice, Ruch Narodowy, and Korwin in Poland. In the Czech Republic, the SPD. In Slovakia, I considered LSNS and VR family. Here I have to note that I was focusing on those parties which are electorally currently relevant and have institutional access to influence policy. Therefore, SNS in my study period fell out. And in Hungary, I dealt with Jobbik and, not much of a surprise, Fidesz. So that just to clarify my focus and my intentions with the paper. What I would like to walk you through is a little bit on the model that I was trying to develop to the extent the policy paper allows for that. And after that, not going through all the policy areas, just highlighting radical right parties' positions on the current EU foreign policy agenda, I would answer the question whether they would pull in one direction, and if so, on what matters. So when discussing the model, trying to assess the impact of radical right on EU level foreign policy, I believe we need to take into account all channels of influence that has to do with foreign policy decision making. In this regard, I consider direct channels of influence and indirect. When it comes to direct channels of influence on EU foreign policy, as I said, I treat it broadly as external affairs, not just CFSP. We need to look at the Council of the EU and particularly its Foreign Affairs Council formation, where governments can be represented. And second, in several areas which are not under CFSP, but under still external affairs like development cooperation and humanitarian assistance and so on, international trade, since they fall under ordinary legislative procedure, here the European Parliament also has the opportunity to play a role. Therefore, I also looked at how radical right parties act in foreign policy relevant European parliamentary committees and in the plenary. These are the direct channels of influence, and these are the areas that I try to focus on the most in my paper. However, we need to also note that radical right parties do also exert very often their influence on policy making indirectly by influencing mainstream actors that then have direct access to policy making. I note this in my paper. It was beyond my scope, but I believe we need to note this because this is one of the reasons why we need to pay attention also to those parties which are currently not necessarily in executive position or not in the EP committees in influential positions, but domestically and through that maybe uploading preferences could have an influence on shaping positions, even on the EU level. So how does this look like in the current political cycle? I was focusing on the period after the election of the current European Parliament, that is from July 2019, and I ended my inquiry at the end of 2020. In this regard, if we look at the 8 parties I initially mentioned, on the EU level, we have 5 which are currently represented in various positions. These 5 parties occupy fairly different positions, and their relative strength is, of course, very diverse. Focusing on the Council, what we need to highlight is, of course, the 2 parties in governing position, leading governments, Fidesz and PiS, as well as we may note the potential influence of VR family, which currently at least is in governing coalition in Slovakia. But VR family does not hold positions in the Slovak government that would have direct foreign policy relevance. So here our 2 main actors, of course, are Fidesz and Law and Justice. When we are looking at the European Parliament, that is where we have, the 5 out of the 8 parties represented, and they are scattered across various political groups. They sit in the European Conservatives and Reformists, Law and Justice, in the new formation of identity and democracy. Here we have the freedom and direct democracy from Czech Republic, SPD. They sit also among the non-affiliated members like LSNS, Jobbik, and currently also Fidesz. During the period that I focused on, Fidesz was sitting still in EPP, therefore we could argue that EPP also had radical right members. So we have these 5 parties in the EP that may have some sort of relevance. So what should we focus on here? First of all, we need to look at what they do in foreign policy relevant committees and what positions they hold. Second of all, we may also survey what they do in the European Parliament's plenary. The second is primarily important for us to inform ourselves about their positions. The first, the committees are important because this is where they can influence legislation primarily. Most directly if they assume positions of rapporteurs and shadow rapporteurs. So how does that look like? The 5 parties are all represented in some of the committees until recently, because with Fidesz leaving the EPP in March, it also lost all its committee positions. So it's going to be another story, and maybe we will come back to it later. But until recently, all parties were represented in committees, and the review of their activities showed that clearly out of the 5, and only partly because of the size of its delegation, is law and justice. Law and justice, out of the 5 radical right parties, was the most active in pursuing positions, in speaking up in plenaries and in the committees also. It was in rapporteur or shadow rapporteur position on most affairs, on most agendas, sorry. In the case of Fidesz, we see a much smaller activity. Fidesz MEPs, although they are also represented in almost the same number as law and justice in foreign policy relevant committees, they cover much less dossiers are covered, and the focus of those dossiers is also much smaller and focuses directly on Hungary's immediate neighborhood. In the case of Law and Justice, we see that the representatives of the party actually cover a fairly wide range of the EU foreign policy affairs. So what we can take away from this is that out of the 5, Law and Justice is clearly the one that seeks to influence EU foreign policy matters the most in the European Parliament, and has therefore capitalized most on having this strong dual representation in both relevant EU institutions on foreign affairs. In the case of the Council, as I mentioned before, but just to circle back a little bit, the positions and priorities of Fidesz and Law and Justice are to be taken into account the most, given that they are in a government position. So what about the positions? Can radical right actors be concerted, and if so, on what areas in the current setting? What I would do here now, instead of walking you through all the areas, which I covered quite extensively in my paper, I would just focus on now those areas that are highest on the EU list of priorities, that is, those that have been identified in the European Commission's program for the current political cycle. So I would touch on briefly free trade, international trade, Africa and development cooperation, enlargement, European defense, and a potential shift towards qualified majority voting. I won't go into detail, we can come back to it in the Q&A. So what do we see here when we look at these 5+3 parties. We see that these parties have relatively different positions towards the EU. They range from soft Eurosceptics to hard Eurosceptics, and this stance influences their positions, of course, on the foreign policy agenda as well. Since all of them, however, are Eurosceptic, it's probably not much of a surprise that none of them are particularly enthusiastic about the idea of shifting towards qualified majority voting in the area of foreign affairs. They, of course, want to keep it as an issue of national sovereignty and as such intergovernmental. What about other areas? International trade, which may be a bit of a surprise, is actually an area where most radical right parties represented currently in EU institutions don't have a strong problem with the European Commission's agenda. They are relatively supportive, even if maybe conditionally, towards furthering the EU's free trade agenda. And it is particularly strong in the priorities of Fidesz and PiS, which also incorporated increasing the relevance of external trade in their foreign policies. What about then the region of Africa, and in connection also development policy? It may not be much of a surprise that, Africa does not feature very high on the agenda of Central European radical right parties. Nonetheless, those in governing positions did have the need to develop a position. And what we can see here is that their positions towards an Africa strategy and including development policy are strongly influenced by their rejecting stance on migration overall. So their positions towards Africa and development policy pretty much securitize the issue. The next area I just briefly want to highlight is enlargement. It may be a surprise, but actually soft Eurosceptic radical right parties in Central Europe, among which I consider Law and Justice, Fidesz, Jobbik, and even Korvin to some extent, are actually not rejecting the idea of EU enlargement. What they, however, are often problematizing is the potential accession of Turkey into the European Union. But when it comes to the Western Balkans, they are actually accepting, even if not being the cheerleaders of the issue, with the exception of actually Fidesz, which is. In terms of defense, just briefly touching on it, the party's positions towards European defense are partly influenced by what I mentioned, to what extent they are Eurosceptic, and how they see NATO. For this reason, among the soft Eurosceptic parties which are not entirely rejecting NATO, there is some reserved support actually for strengthening the EU's defense capabilities, but it is not because of their enthusiasm to give up sovereignty in that area, much rather it fits into their securitizing agenda. Having wrapped that up, and I covered more areas like Russia and China, which we can come back to, what we can maybe conclude is that Central European radical right parties, and particularly the soft Eurosceptic ones, actually do not seek to completely reject the European Commission's current agenda in its entirety. There are areas where that is the case. For example, QMV, and I didn't go into detail on that, but also the normative dimension of EU foreign policy. But in other areas, instead of undermining and completely rejecting the EU agenda, what we see is that they are trying to shift it towards the right, securitizing it, and trying to move the EU foreign policy to fit their priorities, which center around much more security issues. In the case of international trade, they promote it without any sort of normative reservations and dimension, but they do not seek to completely undermine the agenda. Now, one thought on the normative dimension, and then moving into some of my recommendations in this regard. What we see is that radical right parties, partly because of their own authoritarian tendencies and disregard for the liberal values of liberal democracy, they try to exclude any sort of normativity from foreign policy and EU foreign policy. This being uploaded, especially by those who are in governing positions, which we currently see, especially with Hungary vetoing a series of common EU positions, is undermining not just the EU's unity, but also its credibility to pursue a value-based global order and the normative agenda of the European Union. So having said that, what can be done here? Acknowledging that the presence of radical right parties in EU policymaking is currently the reality. What I primarily want to highlight is in connection with radical right parties' indirect impact and this pursuit to shift the agenda. Because of this, it is very often, and particularly in these cases as well, on the mainstream parties, on the mainstream pro-European actors to set up potentially a cordon sanitaire or just simply not co-opt radical right parties' positions, instead offer alternative value-based positions that stick to the European Union's normative identity and make it possible to represent those ideas in its foreign policy as well. Therefore, mainstream actors should be particularly careful in how they engage and to what extent they adopt to radical right parties. It's partly on them to keep the European Union and the European Union's foreign policy on track. This is also true of the EU institutions, especially the European Commission, that needs to pursue also the European Union's normative agenda if it wants to live up to the idea of promoting a value-based global order. And in doing so, also in situations when one of these radical right parties seek to undermine common EU positions, go ahead and stand up for the EU values, because if it doesn't do, it misses an opportunity to stand for the Union's political identity as well. So there are a bunch of other things in the paper I didn't touch on. Maybe they will come up. Thank you very much for your attention. I was a bit longer than I should have been.
Thank you so much, Zsuzsanna, for this very informative introduction. Rosa, as it was already mentioned, you authored several papers in the past with similar research puzzle. How do Zsuzsanna's findings compare to your previous findings, and how do you see them in light of the recent developments? And last but not least, what would be your recommendations? What strategy should mainstream parties pursue to limit the impact of radical right parties on EU foreign policy? Thank you so much. Over to you, Rosa.
Thank you very much, Daniel. Before I start, let me just first of all thank Zsuzsanna, because it's so important that there is continuing research on this topic, and the paper's excellent. I could suggest people read it, but you've also taken us through the various methodological steps and questions that you've been asking yourself, which is critical, because this is actually a very broad area and it's quite difficult to investigate. And the last efforts that I carried out with colleagues at GMF, we were looking at all parties in 28 member states ahead of the European Parliament elections, and looking at how they behaved in the previous legislature. And it was a huge task, and also a multilingual task, because we had to go and find out sources in all the various languages. So it's really good that people are continuing doing this research, because we need to understand this is a moving target. Back in my first work on this was published in 2016. It was another collaborative effort carried out at the European Policy Centre, where I used to work. And at that time, we felt that the direct impact wasn't so strong. And my feeling is, and my observations and your research is confirming this, the impact is getting stronger. So this is something that we really need to look out for. But again, before I start, let me also commend the Rethink Europe fellowship program. I think I've been following it, and I remember Daniel's presentation. I think you were in the first year of the fellowship. It was a few years ago, and I remember several presentations of other fellows, and the work is always excellent. This is a very good program, and it's a delight for me to see you grow in your professions. So what I'd like to do, you asked me how does it resonate with my work. Very much so. I felt there's the conclusions that Zsuzsanna has reached and the type of analysis that she's carried out very much reflects the findings in my previous research, and the preoccupations, and also the policy recommendations go in very similar directions. So what I thought I'd do is just broaden things out a little bit. Maybe my work has actually focused more on populist parties, so it's much broader. Radical rights are part of that group, but it's a broader group. And I also covered Western Europe as well. So maybe I'll be drawing examples also from other political parties and other experiences. And I think I'd like to just focus on 2 or 3 issues or spaces. One is European Parliament dynamics. As I said, making comparisons or just giving examples from Western Europe or other parties. I'd like to say something about the direct and indirect channels of influence, which I think is quite important, but something about the dynamics in the Council, and then a broader issue about why this should be taken as a serious challenge to European integration. Whatever idea of European integration one may have, be it federalist or intergovernmental, but it has to be taken seriously, especially with respect to foreign policy. So let me start with the European Parliament. It's quite paradoxical that historically a lot of the populist parties have actually done very well in the European Parliament on a Eurosceptic agenda, and but we also, so it's paradoxical simply because of what the European Parliament stands for. But there are a couple of things that we can notice here. First is that the Parliament has been very much used, probably more so in the past than now, as a platform, as a springboard for national politics rather than for European politics. So until recently, a lot of these parties were not really taking the work of the European Parliament seriously. Many of them were you know, among the high level of absent members of parliament come from parties such as the League, the Northern League beforehand, the UKIP, even Rassemblement National and its previous incarnations. They've also used the European Parliament as a source of financing, but again, with a very strong focus on national politics. And I'm thinking of those same parties, the strongest, largest radical right parties in France, in Italy, and the UK, until the UK was still a member of the EU. And in this sense, they contrast a bit with the experience, I think, of Fidesz and Law and Justice, which are the two biggest parties, radical right parties from Central Europe in the European Parliament, which conversely have taken the European Parliament much more seriously, and the work of the European Parliament more seriously. So their stories can tell us a lot more about what could be in reserve for the future of foreign policy. But it is the European Parliament, despite the fact that it's not a key actor in foreign policy, is a very important place to discover the positions that these parties have on foreign policy, because that's when they're forced to talk about it. That's when you can actually read what they say through the debates. You can watch them on, you know, web streams and etc. And you can look at their voting behaviour, and they can look at their alliances and their coalition potential, etc. So it's a good case study to pursue. So that's one thing about the European Parliament, this sort of paradoxical role it plays, but also this sort of enabling of discovery. The second point, which you made, it is about the direct and the indirect channels. And I think, you know, if you look at the behaviour of parties in the European Parliament and why, you know, how some of them used it as a springboard for national politics, others used it actually to push for certain positions within the Parliament or to build coalitions. That's how you can see how the direct and indirect channels work. And there's several levels here. One is the national level, and the degree to which these parties manage to be influential in their countries, and how little influential they are alone in the European context. And that's partly just a question of size. But of course, because they're influential in their countries, when they're out of government, their governments are responding to that political pressure. And that's where we've seen this in the European Parliament, but we've also seen it in national politics, the role of mainstream political parties. And someone will contest, what is a mainstream political party? What is not? Definition. There was already a question on what is a radical right. There's lots of things about definitions in these debates, but shall we say the traditional, old-fashioned political parties that dominated politics in the past, shall we say 30 years since the end of the Cold War, their role as gatekeepers. What comes out in all the research is that the role of, in this case, shall we say, centre-right parties as gatekeepers for the public debate is absolutely critical. And the whole story of Fidesz in the European People's Party, which has been unfolding for years and which has recently come to Fidesz's self-suspension, and we talk about that in the paper, is just an illustration of this. And in my own conclusions, which are informed by research, is that the centre-right parties in particular have performed a particularly bad role in this function, and that they have been ambiguous with respect to the platforms that radical right parties have put forward, and very often they have mimicked and taken on board that type of rhetoric, that type of language, in the hope of attracting the electorate that was bleeding towards further right. Now, to the left, the similar dynamics have taken place. So I don't want to say that, you know, the centre-left parties have been strangers to these dynamics, but there are some differences. The first is that the populist parties of the left haven't posed challenges to democracy and rule of law. And secondly, the episodes, the cases, the impact has been smaller, but still there are issues on the centre left, especially with respect to corruption. But I think that the centre right has been, and it poses particularly ideological questions as well as to what do these parties actually stand for, and where is the boundary between centre rights and radical rights. It's increasingly a grey boundary. So that's I think the most important indirect way in which radical right parties have been influencing the agenda. But then, of course, there's also a very direct way, and that is through government. And of course, Poland and Hungary are the two key examples, but not the only one, because let's not forget that Italy had this strange coalition between a radical right and a populist party until a year and a half ago, with the League, with the Five Star Movement, and France. And prior to that, in the 1990s, Italy had a coalition of radical right parties and populist parties, right-wing populist parties in government. And of course, France is always at risk of, the challenge of the Le Pen family has been there since the 1980s to the presidential level. So we know that Marine Le Pen is going to be a candidate again, and we don't know what the outcome of the elections, presidential elections next year in France will be. And of course, in other parties as well, they've been, in other countries, they've been cropping up in important ways. But of course, Poland and Hungary are the most interesting cases because they're in government, and because they are two, and they are able to perhaps occasionally mobilize support from other countries. For instance, Slovenia at the moment is a candidate. There have been talks with leaders of these far-right populist parties in Western Europe, and perhaps that's something else we could talk about. So they risk being, they often are able to form blocking minorities in the council. Yesterday, the Foreign Affairs Council did not manage to reach a conclusion on Israel, and because it was blocked by Hungary, and ministers are increasingly outspoken about Hungary playing this blocking role. And here I'd just like to elaborate a little bit, because this really is my sort of niche thing that I'm looking at. In foreign policy, unanimity is the rule. Every member state has a veto, and the EU is notoriously divided. So does it make a difference that Hungary blocks a statement, a human rights statement on China? It blocks a joint statement with the League of Arab States because, in the end they came out with a statement, but it tries to block it because it doesn't want the word migration mentioned in it. It postponed the approval of Operation Irini, despite the fact that it didn't really affect Hungary in any particular way. And yesterday it blocked Israel. Is it not the same as Cyprus blocking a declaration on Turkey, or Greece blocking a declaration on North Macedonia, or other blockages, long-standing blockages that we see? We saw, in September, August, September, a bit of a tit for tat between Belarus and Turkey, and having to sort of horse trade and reach compromises on two different issues where two different interests were at play. And so it doesn't make any difference. And I think it does. EU foreign policy is notoriously divided, but most of the divisions stem from issues of key national interest. I mean, Cyprus is not just standing up because Canada has, is not blocking something because Canada has done something to the Inuits. It's blocking something because it feels that its sovereignty is at risk. And these dynamics, we see them in those circumstances. Why is Israel so important to Hungary? Well, what is the national interest? I don't know. Daniel, I ask you, maybe you know better than I do. But my feeling is that what these countries are doing in these blockages is actually undermining EU unity. That is their goal. The goal is not a specific national interest tied to the issue in question, the goal is to undermine EU unity because these countries don't want the EU to be a political actor and to have a united foreign policy. And why is that? Because they have, some of these have a pretty clear vision of what Europe should be about. It should be definitely about nation states, but with minimal integration. They like the single market and structural funds, but they don't like rule of law provisions. They don't like interference in domestic affairs. They like to have a free hand in their issues. And that is what these radical right parties have been systematically doing inside their own countries. And that is why I think it is important to look at this also from the perspective of European integration. If these dynamics are entertained in the easiest arena, which is the foreign policy arena, where member states are most divided, what does it mean for the future of European integration? And that's where, and I go back to the Le Pen and the Salvini, etc., there is a commonality of intent. All these parties, since soon after Brexit, decided that they weren't going to advocate an exit from the EU as a policy platform, because they suddenly realized that actually European citizens like the EU a little more than they care to recognize. So they decided that that's not the winning platform. They might change their mind, because these, of course, are changes that are purely opportunistic. They're not driven by ideology. And then, so they decide that. But then they realize that Orban, however different from Le Pen, Salvini, etc., including in their background, is actually proposing a vision for Europe, which is something they could live with. Again, very little interference from bureaucracy, very strong role of nation states. We don't, step onto each other's toes. So maybe they could live with it. It's a much looser Europe, much less integrated Europe. Where really what brings them together is the single market and the structural funds. Can this survive? And I guess the only reason for which the EU so far has managed to contain the populist surge is actually because they disagree with each other. The fact that Poland and Hungary, Law and Justice and Fidesz, disagree fundamentally on Russia is a wedge between them, and even with the League in Italy, Le Pen in France, but also the Brothers of Italy, another radical right party, which has sort of fascist roots, and there've been a lot of contacts between the leader Meloni and Orban. But if you talk about migration, they stand on in completely different positions. I mean, Italy wants the rest of Europe to do more. Hungary wants the rest of Europe to keep immigrants out. So they're completely different. So ultimately, even if they might have this sort of broad Eurosceptic single market idea, even if they do have issues that would make a coalition quite ungovernable. I'll leave it here because I think I've spoken enough, but I'm happy to address questions or comments.
Thank you so much, Rosa, for these extremely interesting insights. We already have a large bunch of questions, so therefore I would propose to go into the Q&A. So ladies and gentlemen, again, please feel free to send us your questions either via the Q&A or the chat function of Zoom. And now I decided not to exploit and abuse my position as a moderator and ask the first question, but rather to transfer the questions to you. We both have a couple of them regarding both the substance of the paper and the methodology. And probably we could start with the substantial ones. So could you elaborate a bit more, Zsuzsanna, what's the position of the Central European radical right parties on the Western Balkan enlargement? Under what conditions do they prefer that? What's potentially the motivation behind that support? Also going a bit more eastward, what's the position of that parties on EAP and the European aspirations of Eastern Partnership countries, especially Georgia and Moldova? Mm-hmm. And whether generally you could a bit elaborate more, but of course these questions are to both of you, on the concrete impact at the EU level of these parties on EU positions regarding other great powers like China or Russia, for example. And just a couple of questions regarding the methodology. A very fundamental question: how do you define radical right in the paper? And potentially a question which can be interesting to most of the participants: that why can we define Fidesz and PIS as radical right parties in spite their self-definition as conservative national right-wing parties? I think that's pretty much enough for the first round, and over to you, Zsuzsanna.
Okay, I think I would actually quickly try to tackle the methodological ones because those are shorter. So who are the radical right parties? I defined radical right based on an ideological criterion, so not based on where they are on the given country's political spectrum. So I'm not calling radical right a party just because it's to the furthest to the right. I'm using the definition of Cas Muda here, who defines radical right as parties which are nativist, that is nationalist and xenophobic, and authoritarian. Optionally, they can or may not be populist, and their authoritarian nature may or may not mean that they stand against democracy as such. So that was my definition. And this is a definition that Populist uses, which is the largest peer-reviewed categorization of parties across Europe, identifying far right, far left, and populist parties. So why can we say that Fidesz and PiS are radical right? I do not consider them radical right from their foundation on. I just want to put that out. These are parties which we could previously consider as mainstream right parties, which through co-optation of their radical right competitors' positions have shifted their own political identity, in fact, political ideology, to the right, and have adopted nativist and authoritarian views. So this is why I do consider them at the time of my analysis as radical right parties. Currently, I do consider them as radical right parties. In the case of Fidesz, I would say this shift already happened in the early 2010s. In the case of PiS, it's a bit harder to grasp. PiS already shifted following its coalition with the League of Polish Families, but from 2015 on, when it's in government, again, I would definitely already categorize it as radical right. So in the period that I'm looking at, both are radical right parties. On to the positions and Western Balkans enlargement. What I have seen is that those radical right parties which are hard Eurosceptic, therefore they would like to take out their country from the European Union, don't formulate a position on enlargement, of course. If they treat the Western Balkans in any way in their programs, and I have to say I focused on manifestos primarily to identify positions, then they potentially treat the countries of the Western Balkans as an extended neighborhood to consider in foreign policy, but none of them are really pushing for deeper cooperation. The soft Eurosceptics, so PiS, Fidesz, Jobbik, We Are Family, and to some extent again Korvin, mostly have some sort of position towards the Western Balkans in terms of enlargement. None of them exclude the possibility. Those who have more detailed positions are in fact the Hungarian parties, partly because of the geographical proximity and because of the significant Hungarian minority living in Serbia. So when it comes to these parties, they actually, Fidesz specifically advocate for Western Balkans enlargement. In fact, even during the current terms, there are seconded diplomats to Western Balkan countries under the Orbán government supporting these countries' accession process through twinning and experience sharing. But they do highlight this question of minority politics, and they if they ask for any sort of adherence to rule of law and democratic principles, then that is respect for minority rights. Apart from that, they are not concerned with the level of democracy. Although Fidesz, for example, does not oppose a Turkish enlargement. Obviously, it's not really on the agenda at the moment. There are some radical right parties which are outright against, like We Are Family. Well, although We Are Family supports the Western Balkans enlargement, it is opposed to the Turkish one. When it comes to the EAP, actually, not many formulate positions on the policy as such. Some of them considers the countries. Obviously, here the Polish radical right parties focus much more on the region, again, geographical proximity, and law and justice is particularly favorable to deepen cooperation with these countries. Here, Fidesz is in principle supportive. In practice, we have seen that the minority question does influence the party's position, particularly towards Ukraine. And here also Hungary has been blocking deepening relations between the EU and Ukraine and NATO and Ukraine. Was there anything else?
Yes, whether you could elaborate a bit more the concrete impacts of the radical right on the EU's relation with other great powers, like, for example, Russia or China.
Okay. Yeah, so as Rosa also pointed out, the radical right across Europe has been fairly divided on various issues, and when we zoom in on the region, relations with Russia actually is a point of division, whereas peace, so law and justice, due to the party's threat perception, is particularly opposing any sort of engagement with Russia or making it conditional upon Russia's international activities and behavior. Fidesz has been unconditionally supportive and embracing Russia. What is the direct impact here? Partly what also Rosa has been talking about, and what I very briefly touched on, is a series of vetoes of common EU positions towards the country. Hungary so far has not vetoed, for example, sanctions against Russia. Here I'm talking about the Fidesz government-led Hungary. obviously, but on any other issue that has human rights dimensions and rule of law dimensions, Hungary has been blocking any sort of unified European approach. So I think that is a very significant impact. Although not on the EU level, but with relevance for the European Union, engagement with Russia in terms of welcoming the headquarters of the International Investment Bank to Budapest raises serious security concerns as well. And similarly, with regards to China, the spending establishment of a university campus of Fudan would not only have relevance for Hungary, but also for the security of the European Union, the university being directly tied with the governing party of China and raising serious security concerns. Here, with regards to China, when it comes to economic positions, the parties are relatively aligned, but over the past years, we also see that Hungary, again, sorry, Fidesz is being much more open to any sort of cooperation with China. Whereas in the case of peace, we do see that, for example, not the EU, but the United States actually has an impact on how the party positions itself. So concrete example I can think of is the 5G network, where under pressure from the United States, actually peace backed out from cooperation with Huawei. So these are broadly related to EU foreign policy, but I think the impact here that we see is either blocking common positions or trying to shift positions towards the right. That appears, for example, more in the field of migration and securitization of any policy area that could have something to do with migration, development policy, humanitarian assistance, strategies towards the Middle East and Africa.
Thank you so much, Zsuzsanna. Rosa, would you like to jump in all discussions?
Yeah, a couple of points I'd like to pick up on. The first, Russia, China, etc. I think with the Russian case, we need to be a little bit cautious because although Hungary, but also other countries with governing coalitions in the radical right. So I'm thinking of Italy when the League was in government. I mean, to be honest, the League still is. There's a kind of national unity government that in which the League is participating, to be precise. But they have never actually threatened the sanction package that the EU has agreed upon since the annexation of Crimea. And even though especially in the first years, there was a lot of discussion: will the sanctions be renewed every year? There's there are moments in the year in which some of these sanctions need renewal. Will they be renewed? And at the beginning, it was an ongoing question, and now that question isn't as salient. And I think the tactic really is to cause a bit of trouble, but not too much trouble. And there are other calculations going on. So the Russia question is not that important. Or hasn't been that important by comparison to others. For instance, with the migration crisis, we saw a much more powerful position coming from Hungary, Poland, but in that case also Czech Republic and Slovakia, which had different types of government and different political parties in power, but they took a very firm stance against the EU. And I think this is a good lesson to look, a good comparison to make because there's also a discussion on introducing qualified majority in foreign policy. Qualified majority voting in foreign policy is on the agenda of the EU Commission, and there's a question as to whether it would be helpful or not. And when QMV was imposed for the relocation mechanism, hell broke loose and the Visegrad 4 blocked it. But I also suspect, or at least there's a time coincidence, it also brought out a more combative spirit, especially in parts of Hungary, to try and sow division within the Foreign Affairs Council and block other issues. So where the blockages come are on matters which are of symbolic value, such as human rights declarations, but they're not of consequence in terms of, the whole security response to the annexation of Crimea and Ukraine. So there's slightly different levels. And I think the real question is, now that Hungary is so much more, well, the first thing, especially with both with respect to Russia and with respect to China, we know that member states, all of them have ambiguous, difficult and divergent relationships and positions, right? So that's the starting point. And we know also that even a country that was keen, let's assume that Hungary was keen to entertain better relations with China. We know also that the German relationship with China is far more important than the Hungarian one, even if now, especially in terms of size, in terms of money, in terms of investments, etc., trade. But the question really is, in my view, whether the fact that Hungary is no longer is open about its relationship with China. It is open about denying academic freedom in its own country and is open to these investments. And the other ministers are explicitly saying, well, actually, it was Hungary that blocked that our position. Before they weren't saying it because, some of them actually probably agreed and they weren't interested in having a common position. So the question is this a prelude for a different level of foreign policy decision-making disruption? And I can't answer that question, but I can pose it. And I think it's something that we really need to keep an eye on. The second issue I wanted to say something about is enlargement. Again, it feels like we're targeting Hungary, but I mean, Fidesz is the party which has the most developed foreign policy agenda and pursues it through the various channels that it has, be they government, be they through its parliamentary representatives, etc. And Hungary asked for the enlargement and neighbourhood portfolio, got it with virtually no discussion or opposition or anything like that. And of course, being a part of that region, with Hungarian minorities, and we know that this is a very emotional issue for Hungary. There are sticking points, shall we say that, because of the Hungarian minorities across the Western Balkans that are now trying to join. So there's sticking points, but there are also lots of relationships, and I think the relationship between Vukovic, the Prime Minister of Serbia, and President of Serbia, excuse me, and Orban is an important one to watch. I think Vukovic has been learning a lot from that and from the relationship with Orban. And there's a sort of populist, authoritarian, radical right playbook that is being used in some countries of the Balkans, which is really Orban's playbook. I mean, he's been very successful in achieving his goals. And so from the point of view of the leader of a radical right party, willing and committed to working within the European arena, if you accelerate the accession of like-minded countries in the Balkans, diluting democratic requirements and standards, then you've got more allies in the European Council to create that havoc that we were talking about earlier. So I think that's another area that really needs to be watched carefully, because there is a risk that there's a risk. The enlargement process has also solid institutional foundations. So let's not say that let's not raise spectres let's not exaggerate about the spectres that we're talking about. But I see on the horizon the potential of a growing group of EU member states and potential member states that ultimately want to undermine European integration. They want to join to undermine rather than join to move together towards more political integration.
Thank you so much, Rosa. We have a couple of further questions to a second round, potentially. We have a question from Ian Bond, who is asking to what extent do radical right parties act as agents of influence for some external actors in the European Union? There is also a question that the paper obviously focuses on the impact of individual parties at EU level. But of course, the institutional frames of the radical right, like European political groups and party families, may have an impact here as well. And there is a well-known and ongoing effort by Matteo Salvini's Lega, PIS and Fidesz to establish a common sovereignist radical right platform at European level. And I would like to ask you, what do you think? How may that endeavor, of course, only if successfully achieved, alter the landscape of influence you decided? And potentially a final question. I think we have spoken a lot about the destructive role of Hungary. And I know that the sample is really small because we have practically 2 radical right governing parties currently from Central and Eastern Europe. But at the first sight, if we take a look on PIS, we don't see a similar behavior. Definitely not at the level of the Council. And I found that part of Zsuzsanna's paper particularly revealing and insightful, where she analyzed the discrepancies in the behavior of the 2 parties at the level of the European Parliament. It was my first impression that PIS is really constructively taking part in the policy-making machinery in the European Parliament at foreign policy level, while we don't see that sort of behavior a part of Fidesz. And my rather provocative question here, do we have really a destructive approach or a destruction problem which we can associate with the radical right? Or we have simply a Fidesz and Hungary problem? I know that we don't have appropriate data to answer that question, but I would be really interested in your take on that. And would you mind, Rosa, to start the second round?
Yeah, very good question. And I think I can only answer intuitively. I mean, my basic sort of premise is that, and it doesn't bother me whether they're radical right, radical left, populist, non-populist. I think, and you know, to an extent, there is a dimension which goes beyond the whole debate of definitions and populism, etc. The key point is that what is happening in Hungary and in Poland is an undermining of the democratic rule of law system, and that has very negative consequences for the EU, for the EU's credibility, and for the EU's capacity to respond to global events. So I think that's the basic point. As for, you know, then look at it from another angle, and I think this is probably the angle that has been adopted by the Commission or by Germany or you know, by the other actors. The EU is sufficiently resilient to include in its fold these actors. And I think in this respect, I would say probably yes, with respect to Poland, because it does play by the you know, within, it does, as you say, it does, you know, play constructively on certain issues. But I worry that Hungary is increasingly becoming an outlier. Why? Because maybe because democracy has been dismantled further, and you know, if I look at the behavior of authoritarian of the heads of authoritarian governments, they really go out of their way in order to stay in power, and I think that's where Hungary is. And the problem is that when the end goal is won, i.e. stay in power, that's when you're playing tactical games that have bigger risks and bigger bigger side effects. So I think that could happen. There's one more point I'd like to raise, because I have mentioned Hungary and Poland a lot, and I'm talking about the governments, not the countries, that just to be clear. But I also think that had shall we say, Western Europe taken into account a little more some predicaments in Central Europe, and in particular, I think the Russian threat for Poland, then there might be different political dynamics taking place in that country. And that's, just to underline that, these developments don't happen in a vacuum. So it's not just that the EU and the EU member states and the institutions responded late to the democratic shortfalls that these countries presented. It's not just that they responded sooner to what was happening in Poland, probably also because the government party was not in the EPP, whereas Fidesz was in the EPP and therefore got a different treatment, more favourable treatment in the early years. So there wasn't early pushback. It's not just that, it's also the degree to which Western Europe has taken on the sort of post-Cold War context, the challenges of transformation that have taken place since then, and have listened enough to what these countries were asking for, demanding, etc. And in this sense, the fact that Britain has left the EU does not play well in terms of finding a greater unity on foreign affairs, because Britain, well, as an Atlanticist, Britain was perhaps listening a little bit more to the arguments coming from Poland, the Baltic states, etc., than France, which is the other sort of big, larger member state. So I think, yeah, I think these are the points I wanted to make. I forget whether, did you ask me another question? I forget, I lost track of that.
Yes, there were two further questions of whether or in what extent act radical right parties as proxies of other external powers in the European landscape, and how do you see the potential impact of this platform of Salvini, PIS, and Fidesz, what is under construction?
So to what extent do they act as proxies? That's a very interesting question, and I have to say I don't have an answer to this. I think it's a combination of both, and I think there's a mutual relationship. These parties welcome foreign interference insofar as it suits them and push back on it when it doesn't suit them anymore, and it's quite a convenient relationship. And if you look at the narratives coming from the Kremlin and Beijing these days about America, which are all about US decline, and they retort back, you're not a democracy, see what's been happening, Capitol Hill, 6th of January, etc., etc. They're not really doing that towards the EU because it's very convenient that the EU has these democratic problems to them because it helps them divide, right? So they're quite different strategies that are being played out there, also by Russia and by China. And then the prospects, no, I mean, as I said, there is this overarching element of potential convergence over a vision for Europe, but it's a very thin vision. And as soon as they talk about, Russia, China, migration, and all those things that, and Russia and China are not mobilizing factors. It's not going to get them into government. It's not going to get them massive. But migration is, nationalism is, and ultimately these elements. If you stand on different sides of the migration debate, these elements there's just ultimately too conflictual. And plus there's all the politics of European Parliament, access to resources, and all sorts of questions there, which make it difficult, I think, to see an alliance. Possible, but difficult. I mean, by and large, if you compare the share of the vote that these parties have and their impacts, I mean, it's not commensurate. They punch below their weight in terms of impact, but they do manage to bang on the sort of drums. They manage to make a lot of noise.
Thank you so much. Zsuzsanna, over to you.
I largely agree with Rosa. So maybe just briefly, I would follow up directly on this, and then whether we have a radical right problem or a Fidesz problem. With regards to cooperation, I fully agree. And what I may add is what we have seen to come out from the Orbán, Salvini, Morawiecki meeting in Budapest is that the narrative these parties built on was not really in any way policy related. They united on their shared socio-cultural positions, which is very nice, and you can advocate for keeping sovereignty at the member states and against certain pursuits of liberal values, but that does not going to keep a coalition together when it comes to actually policy making and having an actual impact. So in this regard, I agree that it's highly unlikely that we will see something substantial coming out of this. Having said that, what I think is interesting to note is that how Fidesz is trying to position itself as a bridge builder, which I believe it is not. Fidesz is now trying to find its ground in the new setting also of the European party families and in the European Parliament, partly because sitting in the non-affiliates is just not beneficial for any party, especially with a relatively bigger representation in the European Parliament. So I would expect that Fidesz will join, in my opinion, ECR probably in the near future, simply because belonging to a political group in the EP is just way more beneficial for a party. But I would not expect any sort of bigger merger than this. Again, having said that, it is interesting to follow how Fidesz is building ties with parties that are currently sitting in identity of democracy. Just very recently, although maintaining that Fidesz's political allies are the Republicans in France, they started to open talks with Rassemblement National, and that is relatively new because until now Orbán tried to keep away from Le Pen. Just last year, Foreign Minister Szijjártó was touring several ID members in Finland, Denmark, and the Netherlands. So there are intensifying contacts also with Western European radical right parties, which are considered less moderate than those who would be sitting in ECR. So on this topic, that's what I would maybe add. Whether we have a radical right or a Fidesz problem and why we see different behaviors between Law and Justice and Fidesz, I do think we have a radical right problem, precisely because of how radical right parties approach simply democracy and democratic governance, and their positions undermine democratic institutions that in the end will then also affect foreign policy. So I think, as Rosa also pointed out, foreign policy here is one angle of a bigger problem that we can observe. And since you picked up on the different behaviors of Law and Justice and Fidesz in the EP, just to touch on that, I think that was also very puzzling for me, and I don't have a definite answer to why that is. But I think it makes a big difference whether you are the biggest party in your political family and have politicians active in foreign policy for a very long time with experience to pick up dossiers on behalf of your political group, like we see in the case of PiS and ECR, or if you are one of the middle-sized members and considered to be a troublemaker in another political group, like we have seen in the case of Fidesz and EPP. Moreover, I think it boils down also to how various politicians approach their role. And in the beginning, Rosa was also talking about this, what the radical right used the European Parliament for. And I think PiS is actually indeed playing much more constructive here and voicing its position, and is using the platform of the parliament way more. The more constructive role I would partly attribute to the threat perception of the party and its views on the US and the US's influence on the party, that I think kind of keeps positions in certain regards at bay. But when we look at Fidesz, I had the pleasure to go through 1.5 years of data on what they say in the EP. And MEPs have the option to explain their votes in the European Parliament in writing. And that's perfect because one can build on that to learn their positions. And if you look at the positions voiced here from Fidesz MEPs, and here I particularly looked at those who sit in also committees of foreign policy relevance, you will very soon have a sense of déjà vu that you have read this. And indeed you have, because all of them submit the very same text verbatim if they submit explanations for the vote. So there is obviously a central message that is sought to be communicated here, but it's less the individual work of the MEP, and you do not see that in the case of Law and Justice. So the take on their role in the EP is very different as well. Thanks. On agents of influence, I would just what Rosa said. So.
Thank you so much. Zsuzsanna, Rosa, I wish we could discuss the topic longer. So personally, I learned a lot from this exchange, but as we're approaching the end of the webinar, I would like to say a very big thank you for all of the insightful takes you shared with us. Ladies and gentlemen, also thank you for being with us today. Have a nice evening and hopefully see you next time. Goodbye.
Thank you very much. Goodbye.